Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to continue our discussion on your second line of defense, your innate immune system, with talking about your inflammatory response today. So, when we look at inflammation in your body, this is typically a result of some sort of cellular injury, and that injury can come literally from injuries, cuts, scrapes, um, blunt force trauma, that kind of thing, but they can also result from damage as a result of infection. Viruses come in, invade your cells, and when they go to release themselves, they blow your cells apart. Or other toxins produced by bacteria that are degrading cellular activity. So, your inflammatory response is a non-specific defense. And typically, when we talk about inflammation, it's usually localized to wherever that damage is currently taking place. So, the site of the infection or the site of the injury. When we talk about inflammation, it's usually characterized by a certain suite of traits, that being redness, heat, swelling, and pain. And all of those characteristic symptoms of inflammation, really the idea here is to take the area that is currently being damaged or injured and isolate it from neighboring tissue to protect that neighboring tissue, those neighboring cells from getting damaged as by the same reason that the current cells that are being damaged are in distress, so that we can clear out those damaged cells, replace them, take out any sort of dangerous microorganisms that might be around, and then restore that area. So this is sort of like coordinating off a spot in your house that is currently under construction, and you don't want the dust and the dirt and the debris floating around the rest of your house, so you may put up plastic tarping, and that sort of idea. It's kind of what your immune system is doing, is walling off that area that needs to be repaired and keeping everything else around it healthy and functional. So when we look at your inflammatory response, any stimuli that's killing cells, damaging muscle fibers, damaging tissues, is going to trigger these things called mast cells. And these mast cells are connective tissue cells. So their job in eliciting a lot of those symptoms comes from the fact that they release a certain set of compounds. So when these mast cells are triggered by any sort of cellular injury, they're going to release histamine, serotonin, and heparin. And those three molecules really are responsible for the characteristic symptoms we think of when we think of inflammation, the redness, the pain, the heat. And here's why. So when those mast cells release things like histamine and heparin, these two compounds in your body cause your blood vessels to dilate, meaning that they get bigger. And as a result, as those blood vessels dilate and increase in their diameter, they become more permeable, meaning that things are able to move in and out of them more effectively. So they get leaky. And so you're going to increase blood flow to the area, which is where that warmth and that redness is going to come from. You're going to get diffusion of blood plasma out of your blood vessels and into the surrounding tissue, which is going to cause the swelling. That increased swelling can also lead to some pressure, which may be perceived as pain. We're also doing all of this really as a way to increase the delivery of nutrients, oxygen, phagocytotic white blood cells, blood clotting proteins, all of this stuff, trying to get the situation, the damage under control. Serotonin is also something that these mast cells produce, and those can also stimulate your neural endings, specifically your pain receptors, and that's where you get the sensation of pain. In addition to activating those mast cells, we will also activate your macrophages, your neutrophils. These guys will release chemicals called cytokines, And these cytokines are signaling molecules that also help to enhance just your general immune response. So cytokines for now, they're signaling molecules. It's a big category of molecules. We'll come across them when we get more in depth in cellular communication later this year. But their job is just to be able to communicate messages. And in this case, they are messages specifically to say, hey, help, there's problems, we need more cells here, specific types of cells here in order to help clear out the damaged cells, wall off healthy tissue. And so those guys will activate more specific responses by eliciting more cells to come in. Your inflammation response or your inflammatory response may also produce pus as a byproduct of this sort of cleanup process. Just pus is just fluid plasma that ends up getting coordinated off into a small area. It's full of white blood cells, dead pathogens, cellular debris, and you either end up being able to see it, you end up leaking it, or eventually your body breaks it down over time once the situation is well in hand. So if you take a look, here's just kind of the example diagram of the inflammatory response from a puncture wound. So we've got a pin that has pricked the outer layers of the cell, or outer layers of your skin, I should say. You've got bacteria hanging out there that naturally do. They're meant to stay out there. You end up now pushing them into your body as a result of that pin pricking and breaking open the skin. So we're disrupting that barrier layer. So you'll have your mast cells that get brought in. You'll have other white blood cells that are now going to be able to more easily leak out into the surrounding tissue as a result of things like the histamine and the heparin that those mast cells are releasing. Some of those will be phagocytotic cells, so they'll start eating up that bacteria that's there. You'll get fluid, extra fluid, so that'll cause swelling. We'll get platelets that may come in here and sort of wall up the damage here that's been caused, and so on and so forth. And these mast cells, or excuse me, these phagocytotic cells may also be releasing those cytokines to bring in things like maybe B and T cells that will be able to provide a more targeted response, I should say, for the bacteria or whatever happens to have been brought in as a result of breaking the skin from that pin. This is a nice sort of way to sort of work your way through what's happening as well. So just kind of something to take a look at. When you talk about increased blood flow, right, there's where the heat and the redness is coming from. Why are we doing it? To increase oxygen and nutrients. It's also going to increase temperature, which is going to increase the metabolic rates of your cells to get things there. Protein-rich fluids being leaked, right? So pain and swelling as a result. And ultimately, all of this is there to promote that healing in the long term. So kind of just a nice thing if you're like flowcharts and want to see where pieces fit together. This is a really nice one to take a look at. So your inflammatory response is typically a localized response, and a lot of times localized due to some sort of actual injury. When we talk about fever, on the other hand, this is another similar idea in terms of inflammation, but now we're talking about an entire systemic response. And you don't typically see fever from a cut, scrape, or puncture wound. You're not going to see that, at least not initially, because the fever is usually a response to some sort of invading microbe. So it could be a byproduct of that injury, allowing microscopic organisms from your skin to get into your tissues and blood flow and causing infection, or it could just be another infection from some other form. Your fever is a way for your body to create a positive feedback loop to basically ratchet up your body's temperature. So take this a step back for a second. We're talking about increasing heat. And when we look at your body, we look at microorganisms, we look at pathogens, everything is based off of the same biochemistry: carbs, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. So one of your body's defenses is to turn up the heat in the hopes of denaturing the proteins, denaturing perhaps even the nucleic acids in the microbes that are invading. If we can destroy those molecules, then the ability for that microbe to continue to survive and reproduce gets destroyed right along with those molecules. Now, it's a positive feedback loop. So we are doing this in response to these chemicals secreted by your leukocytes or macrophages anytime that they're exposed to bacteria or other foreign substances, these things called pyrogens. And so long as those pyrogens are present, we're going to continue to turn up the heat. So those pyrogens are only getting produced in response to the fact that those leukocytes and those macrophages are continuing to encounter pathogens. What I will say is that these fevers oftentimes are much more likely to be seen with bacterial infections than you do see them with viral infections. That's not to be said that viral infections can't induce fever. It's just not as common across the board to see that fever with a viral infection, where the bacterial infections, it's almost always a guarantee. Here's the other interesting thing. So that fever is your body's natural response. It's a good thing. We want that fever to do its job. Um, and yet, most of us, probably in our lifetimes, the second that that thermometer reads 99 degrees, we're popping anti-inflammatories, things like ibuprofen, which you may know as Aleve, aspirin, acetaminophen, or you may know it as Tylenol. But here's the interesting thing. This particular set of diagrams, set of graphs, is from a study specifically looking at fever and the common cold. So if you were to start popping those anti-inflammatories as soon as you see a fever, you actually seem to increase the days in which you remain sick, um, as opposed to the placebo where we don't end up giving you anything. So there seems to be at least some minor correlation between your taking of anti-inflammatories and actually increasing the length at which you remain ill, which is kind of interesting. Side note here, I am not a medical professional, and so I am not offering medical advice, but the results of this study seem to say that at least for those low-grade fevers, you're actually better off letting your body do what it's supposed to do, create that fever, than to go ahead and just start popping anti-inflammatories. It seems to suggest that your recovery time will be quicker, at least marginally anyway, to something like the common cold. So why do we take these anti-inflammatories? Why is it such a response for us to be taking these medications when we have a fever? Well, because they do a good job when you get to the point where high fevers are a problem. So once we start talking about fevers up to 102, 103, 104 degrees, now we're at a point where we're concerned not necessarily just about damage to the microorganisms that are infecting you, which is the point of the fever in the first place, but now we're also concerned about starting to damage your own cells. And so we need to get that fever under control because it's a positive feedback loop. So long as the stimulus is in place, aka the infection is still raging, your body will just continue to turn up the heat. It doesn't have an off switch until that infection is gone. So it doesn't recognize where it is on a thermometer. And so we can get to the point where your body just continues to turn the heat up so much that it starts doing damage to your own cells, to your own tissues. And most likely we're worried about brain damage. Those are some of the biggest tissues that really sort of don't do well once your fever gets to a certain point. So again, these high fevers can be incredibly dangerous because they're denaturing our own enzymes, our own proteins. And so you can end up in a situation where you are in septic shock. So this life-threatening condition where you just had this overwhelming inflammatory response, this and we can't turn it off. Your body has gotten so out of control that it just can't stop it, and the infection's continuing to rage, and so we're just stuck in this positive feedback loop that we can't break. Again, those moderate fevers, however, can be beneficial. So not only is it there to destroy the biochemical molecules of the pathogen, but it also does some other interesting things in our body as well. A lot of microorganisms, bacteria especially, need things like iron and zinc as part of their metabolic processes to gather materials and be able to reproduce. But your fever actually causes things like your liver and your spleen to sequester or take out of basically circulation iron and zinc. And so it lowers those levels of minerals in your blood, allowing them to not be as accessible to those microorganisms that are causing you that infection, which is pretty cool. Also, just increases your general metabolic rate across the board, which can also help to speed up tissue repair from any sort of damage that's being inflicted from that pathogen itself.